I want to first go across to Max Abrahms, author and international affairs expert, professor, joining us on the show. Max is one of those American personalities that met the Prime Minister in those closed-door meetings. Max, thanks a lot for your time. You've, of course, talked about how happy you were with the meeting with the Prime Minister and how he sat with you in that circle with humility. Before I talk to you about Indo-US ties and where this visit is taking them, you want to share with us a few things from that meeting?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I got an email from the ambassador seeing if I would be willing to meet with the Prime Minister. And of course, I said yes. The Prime Minister has many different meetings this week, the most important of which are with American government officials, including, of course, President Biden and his wife, Jill Biden. And so he's meeting in DC with, current American officials. And this meeting was just a small group of those who are outside of government, about 5 of us from think tanks and
Yes.
universities. And what impressed me most was that we weren't told in advance any limitations on what we could say to the Prime Minister. There were no limitations on any questions that we could ask him. And that's sort of contrary to some of his critics who say that he's, very insular, that he's, authoritarian, that he doesn't face any kind of dissent. And this was absolutely the opposite. We sat together on around a small circle. So he wasn't trying to create, a huge amount of distance. And we went around the room and we said whatever we wanted to. He listened to us one by one. And then he responded through a translator.
So what
And
was
for
your
me,
conversation
I
like?
don't really know if he learned anything from us, but I certainly learned something about him, and that is how accessible he was. And I did view it as a very sort of humble act to just sit among, a small group of those who are outside of government to hear some concerns and to take them seriously. So overall, I was very impressed with the meeting.
You want to share exactly what your exchange with him was about? What did you tell him? What did he tell you back?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really want to get into the specifics that much, but I can say something, relatively uncontroversial, which I did say to him. And that is that, perhaps the greatest asset that India has is its human talent. And as a professor based in Boston, I mentioned that some of my very best students are Indian students, and I have an excellent Indian co-author. And so the effects of that human talent are felt very strongly throughout American higher education. And so I thought I would share that with him.
All right. So, Max, you're an expert in international security in the areas of terrorism, counterterrorism, and US foreign policy. Now, a lot of experts have been saying that while the name of the country is not being taken, this visit of the Prime Minister being a state visit and the amount of focus the Indo-US ties are getting right now are predominantly to counter China. Do you agree with that analysis?
Certainly, the media coverage is focusing on this angle of countering China, and it's not wrong. I will say that in the meetings that I have had with the actual parties to this Modi visit, that a surprisingly large portion of them focus on business, business ties between India and the United States, as well as talk about normative ties, moral ties, democratic ties, in the sense of really building a long-term relationship as allies in this rapidly developing world. After the Cold War, things have changed so much, and so I think that India is part of this new picture of great powers. And there's talk about India joining the UN Security Council, for
Yes.
example. And that's relatively new, at least among American officials, right?
Okay.
But there's no question that this important state visit happens in the shadow of growing American concerns of a rising China, the concerns that China is, going to really contest the United States as a unipolar, hegemonic power in the world. And that more specifically, of course, there are concerns that China will make a move on Taiwan. And so India and China, they have a complex relationship. They do a huge amount of trade.
Okay.
India consumes more goods from China than any other country. But on the other hand, they're not close allies. And there's a sense that the United States, if there is, growing conflict with China, if there is war with China, that it would be very advantageous for the United States to be able to count on India even more, to side with the United States, as well as to develop, to build up its military power, both independently and in concert with U.S. weapons systems. I spoke to a professor at the Naval War College who was saying that China would really have its hands full, with the naval war plus a land war if we could count on India. Now, I think that that's not realistic. There was a recent article out in Foreign Affairs saying that India wants to maintain its neutrality. It's not interested in getting a war, getting into some kind of a war like that. And I think that that's correct. But nonetheless, there is growing concerns of China, and there's a feeling that India could be a very important asset in
Yes.
terms of counterbalancing that rising power.
Yes, I don't think anybody expects that India would join a war with the US, just like possibly US wouldn't join a war with India. But I think you're right about the fact that both will see each other as important assets if there were conflicts to be. But of course, India stands, as the Prime Minister repeats again and again, for no conflicts and for peace in the world. I do want to touch upon the fact that you mentioned...
I totally understand that. It's very premature to talk about any kind of an imminent war, even between the United States and China. And what India is really known for is carving out its own independent path and not being sucked into great power conflict. And so I would expect India to play a similar role as it's playing in terms of the conflict in Ukraine with Russia, where India is able to maintain its strong relationship with the United States without becoming a combatant.
Max, I was very intrigued by what you said earlier. You talked about how Prime Minister Modi has this image that, of an autocrat, or there are other words that are thrown around for him. And particularly, he comes under scrutiny, and India under him comes under scrutiny for the treatment of minorities. I was just actually watching President Obama has given an interview to our sister concern CNN in the US, where Xi Jinping of China and India's Narendra Modi have been talked in the same breath. And concerns over minority treatment has been spoken about by the president as well. How do you see these concerns being raised while the Prime Minister is in the US?
Well, that is part of the visit, is that, when you have any leader, it's not going to be, uniformly well received. And so the knock against Modi is that he is illiberal when it comes to minorities, especially Muslims in India. But some American politicians, especially the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, they're the ones sort of playing up this anti-Modi message. People like Bernie Sanders, for example, I believe that they might be recusing themselves or boycotting Modi's talk to Congress. But I do think that that's a minority view among American officials, both Democrats and Republicans, and I think that it's also a minority view across the American public.
Okay.
There are all sorts of reasons to support stronger U.S. relations with India. For starters, it's very important in terms of the economy. India is the most populous country in the world. It's recently overtaken China. It's very, educated, a lot of very smart people there working on, all of the sort of new technology, which is going to usher in this new economy in terms of AI, in terms of semiconductors. It's also very useful in terms of our foreign policy, in terms of acting as a deterrent against China's expansion.
Okay.
And it's also going to help to hopefully wean India off of Russian weapons. And so there are all sorts of reasons to be supportive. And on top of that, Modi, I've seen in polls around the world, is the most popular national leader of any country. And so the main story is that there's American enthusiasm for this unprecedented meeting. And yes, of course, there are some critics, but
Okay.
I think that that's really a marginal part of the visit.
All right. Max Abrahms, thanks a lot for sparing your time and thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts.